It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. General Motors announced on Monday that it will close 5 of its plants in Canada and the U.S. and lay off about 14,000 workers. Some of these plants, such as the one in Oshawa, Canada, and the one in Baltimore, have been in operation since the 1950s. GM says that the decision is necessary because of the declining consumer demand for sedans such as the Chevrolet Impala, the Chevrolet Cruze, and the Buick LaCrosse. Also, it will halt production of the hybrid Chevy Volt. Now, GM did not connect the closing of these plans to Trump's trade policies, but Ford Motor Company has said that its bottom line is suffering at least $1 billion in losses because of the tariffs on imported aluminum and steel that Trump imposed earlier this year. Let us remind you that back in 2009, the U.S. and the Canadian governments bailed out GM, which entered bankruptcy in the wake of the global financial crisis. The U.S. bailout cost the taxpayers about $12 billion. More recently, the Chevy Volt benefited from over $100 million in subsidies from the U.S. government. Joining me now to discuss GM plant closings are Leo Panitch and Frank Hammer. Leo is a senior scholar and professor emeritus for political science at York University. His most recent book is The Socialist Challenge Today, co-authored with Sam Gindin. They also co-authored a piece in the Socialist Register 2019 titled Trumping the Empire. This year's Socialist Register is titled A World Turned Upside Down. Thanks for joining us, Leo.
Glad to be here, Sharmini.
And Frank Hammer is a retired auto worker from Detroit, longtime UAW union member, and a member of the Real News Board of Directors. Frank, good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Frank, let me start with you, your reaction to the GM announcement. You've been an auto worker for so many decades, and they are closing 2 plants in the Detroit area. So let me get your reaction to this and how some of your former plant workers and maybe retired workers and the current workers that you're working with are reacting to this decision.
Well, first of all, it was a shock to GM workers, not because they didn't know that we're having some issues in General Motors. There are several plants that are down to 1 shift. There are plants that don't have future product in their mix. So there are issues that are going on, but it was a shock that GM made the announcement the way it did. Mary Barra hastily called this meeting, the shareholders meeting, on Monday morning and thanked everybody for showing up in short notice. And I just recently got the notice that UAW Local 22, which represents the workers at Detroit Hamtramck Assembly Plant, he announced, the shop chairman of that local announced that he was informed Monday morning that he had to attend an emergency meeting with a GM executive, and that was scheduled for the same morning. So in the UAW, the leadership didn't indicate when they learned about these decisions that Mary Barra announced, but it was certainly had a lot of shock value, and the UAW was apparently gave no indication that it was pre-warned. So it doesn't speak very well for the relationship that, there's supposed to be all this partnership between General Motors and UAW. So I think the first reaction is a state of shock. And I know that one of the plants, the one in Canada, in Oshawa, that the workers actually walked out of the plant in protest of the announcement. So my plant is one of the ones that was announced to be closed. It's the Warren transmission plant. And there, I once represented 3,500, 4,000 workers, we're down to less than 300 workers, and we have a million square feet of production space. So workers are, rightfully concerned.
And,
by the announcement.
and Frank, what are the reasons being provided to the workers in terms of the closings?
Well, the reasons that are being put out in public has to do with GM cars, certain cars they're not selling, and so on. But namely the big sedans is what they're saying. But GM is also putting out that this has something to do with producing electric cars. I don't quite understand the connection. And also saying that they're going to produce driverless cars. I don't know what that's got to do, what the connection between that is and closing plants.
All right, Leo, let me go to you. You're in Toronto, not too far from the Oshawa plant that is closing. How is all these decisions to close the plant in Oshawa and General Motors laying off 14,000 workers? How is that being received there?
Well, it's the main item on the Canadian news. It's all over the front pages of the newspapers, as you can imagine. And the responses to it have been, on the one hand, the Trump-like Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, saying the ship has sailed, there's nothing we can do about it, our hearts go out to the workers, and our federal Prime Minister Trudeau meeting with Jerry Diaz, who's head of Unifor, the former United Auto Workers in Canada, and listening to him and his anger, but not doing anything more than saying, we'd like to help the workers. On the other hand, you've had one response echoed in letters to the editor, coming from a business journalist in the Toronto Star, calling for the nationalization of the whole of General Motors in Canada, not just this plant that has been so productive and has the best paint shop in the world being closed, but the whole of General Motors should be nationalized, and we should use those facilities to produce the most advanced technology, either automobiles or public transit vehicles, that we could on that basis. Now, that's thinking outside of the box, but it's the kind of thinking that's needed in the face of this type of corporate hubris, which obviously has been announced now, only now. It's been planned for a very long time in the wake of the American midterm elections. The reason this was not announced before was because of the wrath it would have incurred from Donald Trump had it been announced before the midterm election.
Leo, you have written the book on In and Out of Crises, and at the introduction to this piece, I alluded to the fact that after the financial crises, GM was bailed out with taxpayer dollars, both here in the United States and in Canada. And of course, there's been a deterioration of wages and workers' benefits and so forth since that crisis, and perhaps even before that. Tell us the climate in which these workers' conditions have deteriorated over this time.
Well, those who've held on to jobs, they are in much better position than their former workmates who lost their jobs in previous years, as Frank said, as the union let GM lay off people while giving them promises that they would keep plants open. Those who've been hired in have been hired in on a two-tier basis, whereby younger people are hired at half the wages that workers who've been there for some period have had. And that, of course, breaks the basic principle of union solidarity. There's been a significant weakening of the unions as a result. And, as Jerry Diaz said, GM has shown the middle finger to the Canadian government, both Ontario and federal government, in making this decision after taking all that money from them. But they're also showing the finger to the union in question, which has done everything possible through concession bargaining to keep these plants open. And in the long run, it's a reflection of the weakness of the union.
All right, Frank, let me go to you. You were saying when you worked at that plant, there was some 4,000 plus workers, and now it's down to 250 or so. How did this decline happen? And also, if you could address the ways in which a just transition could take place for some of these workers and save the jobs instead of laying them off.
So the process that's been underway for decades has been a combination of outsourcing, whether it be to non-union locations in the US or to locations outside the US. Best example is, of course, Mexico, where GM just months ago announced that they were going to produce a new Chevy Blazer, a crossover or an SUV in Mexico, or producing the work in the cars in China. Their Buick is produced in China for US import. I recall as far back as 2005, General Motors telling all the suppliers, if you want to continue to do business with us, you have to go to China. So it's been that partially. And the other part, of course, is automation and robotization. So that if you walk into my plant today, you know, you hardly see a human soul, you hardly see a worker because it's all machines. So it just seems to me that General Motors is going more and more to a workerless factory, which is their ultimate aspiration, as well as going to driverless cars. That's what's gone down, and we've lost product in my plant. We only make transmissions now, and there's no future work in sight. But I think this announcement is also very clearly being used to exercise leverage on the negotiations that are scheduled for next fall. And Mary Barra in her conference made it very clear that that's what one of their aspirations. And UAW, the GM department director, put out a letter 2 weeks ago in advance of Monday's announcement saying that we'll all be lucky if we have a job, and the job and product security will be the #1 demand in the next round of negotiations. So this is already setting up the framework for what to expect in 2019. So to your second question, the UAW at its convention in June acknowledged, I think maybe for the first time, that we are in the throes of climate change and that this is a serious problem. It's we should really use the terminology climate catastrophe. And if it takes its words seriously, it should be responding by saying if there are any facilities that are to be closed, we should reopen the dialogue and talk about how can the plant not be closed, but reconverted, repurposed to produce, whether it be rapid transit components, whether it be renewable energy components, but these facilities can be put to use, and our workforce, which is highly trained, can be put to making products that we need, so that we can reduce carbon emissions and try to secure a safe planet for ourselves and our future generations.
Leo, in terms of GM's own policies, it is, of course, in the business of making profit here, nothing else. But would a different strategy have been possible for the company, which would allow these plants to remain open, for the jobs to remain in place, and referencing some of what Frank just said about a environmentally conscious policy that would also save jobs?
Well, look, the great irony of this is that the biggest sellers for GM at the moment are these giant pickup trucks. In today's Toronto Star, just plastered with articles and devastating photographs of the workers who are going to be laid off. There is a full-page section, an ad that obviously was placed a long, long time ago before it was run, called Best New Vehicles 2019. And second at the very top are the Silverado and Sierra, the large pickups that GM produces, which the Oshawa plant is assembling. GM is in the situation of talking about something that's not going to happen for 2 decades at best in terms of driverless cars or completely electric cars, while it's making its profits on these gas-guzzling pickups. That's what it's making its profits on. That's what it's primarily going to continue producing. I think Frank's absolutely right that this particular announcement has everything to do with the forthcoming negotiations and putting the scare into those workers who are there. At the same time, there is tremendous research and development capacity with brilliant engineers, brilliant skilled workers, brilliant technicians who even are here in Canada. There are 2 R&D centers in Canada, and just last year, the City of Toronto approved GM opening a site right on Lakeshore Boulevard, where they were going to showcase their technological expertise. It is about time that the union itself started calling for democracy in the automobile sector. And we desperately need it because so many parts companies, there are 3 Canadian international, very competitive parts companies. One of them already announced the closure of 2 plants by virtue of this announcement in Oshawa. It's about time that it was said loud and clear that we are going to democratize this crucial sector of the economy. We're no longer going to be handing over billions of dollars with absolutely no guarantee with regard to economic planning of both technology and labor in our society. That's the conclusion that the left needs to draw from this, and indeed get some ambition as a result of this kind of devastating.
All right. Either one of you can respond to this, but it seems that part of the motivation for closing these plants is based on the declining gas prices, Leo. I mean, those big trucks are gas guzzlers, which is leading consumers away from apparently more fuel-efficient cars. This is what they're saying, because the gas prices are lower. Now, if you factor that in, and we are facing an environmental crisis, why do people want to move towards SUVs and those large trucks you saw in the Toronto Star, Leo?
Well, Frank may be able to answer this better than I. I mean, I don't quite understand why this is so popular. I imagine you're right that it partly has to do with somewhat lower prices at the pump. But I think people are simply not conscious enough of the effects of this in a larger sense. And it must be said that there is a contradiction here. Were you to make a case for bringing the auto sector into the public sector, what would environmentalists be saying about this? And part of the problem that I think exists, certainly in terms of our governments, but even more broadly on the left, is we need to be strategically planning ahead of time. If there were plans on the shelf for how plants like these could be converted into socially useful production, with the capital that's there, the technology that's there, the tremendous skills that are there, if there were plans on the shelf, we'd be readier to move, and we could be readier to move in a way that was ecologically sustainable. The fact that we aren't planning at that level, and indeed I think that great unions in the past, like the UAW, aren't putting the resources into doing that, is an indication of the problem.
All right, Frank, let me have you respond to this as well. Given the environmental crisis we are facing, the globe is facing, you know, and declining oil prices, what is this desire to move towards larger cars, SUVs, and trucks?
Well, I think Leo said it pretty well, and I just remembered that the heightened contradiction is evident in a plant in Arlington, Texas, where apparently all the power that's supplied to the assembly facility is all by renewable energy. I think it's like solar panels or wind turbines, I'm not sure. And inside they're producing the trucks. So General Motors has responded in part to the question of, you know, climate change and environmental sustainability, but it still wants to make money off the trucks, and the trucks are very, very popular, as are SUVs. And the fact that you can go out and get gas at $2.50 a gallon here in Detroit, you know, makes it a no-brainer. Of course, people are going to go out and get trucks. So
there's been a huge campaign on the part of the NDP and people like Naomi Klein and others leading a campaign for the auto sector and for labor unions and so on to get a grip on the environmental disaster we are facing. In places where the unions gather, is this having an impact?
So I was speaking with a friend of mine who, by the way, works at the Detroit Hamtramck Assembly Plant, and there's a whole story there because when it came into Detroit only 33 years ago, it was done by eminent domain, and Poletown, which used to be a large community of many, many Polish residents, auto workers, was all cleared out, was wiped out, so that they can put this plant in place. And now they're talking 33 years later, now we're talking about closing it down and what impact that's going to have in Detroit. So anyway, I was speaking with him and he said, you know, auto workers don't talk about climate change. There's nobody in this plant that's talking about climate change. And I put that at the, you know, at the feet of the UAW that I think I saw one article in the last 4 years in their UAW publication talking about climate change and environmental sustainability. So it has to address this, and of course, the question of the gas price is a deterrent. It's something that doesn't facilitate the conversation of what it means for transportation is a leading emitter of carbon emissions today in the United States, over and above power plants. It's vehicles, it's transportation. So that dialogue has to happen, and we have to convert the plants to produce mass transit and get people, you know, weaned from their vehicles and starting to realize that we have to change our ways. And that's going to be very difficult, but the UAW has taken a back seat as far as convincing its own membership.
All right.
I do have to say, you know, having also pinned this to some extent on the unions, I think we have to be very careful not to blame the victim here. This is a matter of a set of capitalist corporations, of which GM is one, which is itself talking a good line on the environmental crisis, electric vehicles, et cetera, but is investing in the destruction of the environment. And the only way to overcome this does not lie primarily with the workers who, in this sense, are passive recipients of capital's decisions. We need to have a system of democratic economic planning and take these decisions about what is invested, where it's invested, what is produced, how it's produced, away from these undemocratic giant corporations. They are at the root of the problem.
All right, Leo. Leo is the author of The Socialist Challenge, today that he co-authored with Sam Gindin and Frank Hammer. Did you want to say something, Frank, before we left? Before we leave here.
Oh, certainly the responsibility lies with the capitalist elites. And the question here is, what is the road forward for workers? And I think workers are going to have to take the lead and say, we want to repurpose our economy and repurpose what we do so that we can have a sustainable future. But the blame is certainly not on the worker.
All right. I've been speaking with Frank Hammer, a retired auto worker from Detroit, and Leo Panitch, the author of The Socialist Challenge today. I thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So long, Frank. So long, Sharmini.
Thank you, Leo.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.